The first thing you need to know about Seoul is that it doesn't sleep. It just changes shifts. At 11:47 p.m., when the Culinary Institute's kitchen lights were finally dark and the last professor had locked the last cabinet, a different kitchen woke up. A rented studio apartment on the fourth floor of a building with a broken elevator in Mapo-gu. The kind of place that smells like someone else's life. The kind of place nobody looks for a chef. But Zuri Adeyemi wasn't hiding. She was working. She moved through the small kitchen the way water moves through a narrow channel, purposeful, inevitable, unhurried despite the speed. Her braids were pinned high and wrapped in a cotton scarf printed with Ankara patterns that her mother had sent from Lagos in a box stuffed with dried crayfish and too many prayers. The crayfish was in the stock. The prayers were somewhere in the steam. On the counter beside her, a notebook thick with handwriting in 3 languages, margins crowded with sketches of plating arrangements, flavor equations that her professors would call reckless, and sticky notes that said things like suya spice plus doenjang equals question mark, question mark, question mark, and then 2 pages later, circled twice in red, yes. Her phone buzzed, then again, then 4 times in quick succession. She didn't look at it yet. She was in the middle of something. The Egusi reduction was speaking to her, telling her it needed 30 more seconds and a half teaspoon of something she was still deciding on. Her hand hovered over the spice rack, a shelf that existed outside of any Korean culinary logic. Gochugaru beside uziza leaf, sesame oil beside palm oil that she rendered herself because the store-bought version lied to her tongue. She chose the perilla, tore it by hand, and dropped it in. The smell that rose from that pot was the smell of 2 worlds agreeing on something. She finally picked up her phone. New order. The Signal package X2. Drop before 1 a.m. Pained. She smiled. Small. Controlled. Like someone who'd learned not to celebrate too early. This was how it had started 3 months ago. A dare, almost. A desperate bet. Her scholarship covered tuition and a modest stipend that ran out well before the month did. Seoul was expensive in ways Lagos hadn't prepared her for. She'd started cooking real food, her food, for the 2 Nigerian students she knew at the institute, then for their friends, then for their friends' Korean roommates who kept asking, "What is that smell?" in a tone that wasn't a complaint. She hadn't meant to build something, but here it was. The delivery service had no real name. She called it Nothing. Her regulars called her Z. The menu changed every week, typed in clean, minimal fonts on a private Instagram account with 847 followers and 0 posts. Just stories that disappeared after 24 hours. The orders came through DMs. The payment was Kakao Pay or cash left in an envelope. The food arrived in matte black containers with a single sticker, a small flame drawn in gold ink, hand-stamped. Nobody knew who Z was. That was the point. Subscribe and hit the notification bell. You don't want to miss where this goes. 3 kilometers away and 12 floors up, in an apartment that cost more per month than Zuri made in 3, Park Ji-hoon sat in front of a plate he hadn't touched. The restaurant had been Michelin-starred for 6 consecutive years. The chef had flown in from Lyon specifically because Ji-hoon had agreed to attend. The dish in front of him, a deconstructed bouillabaisse with saffron foam and hand-dived scallop, would have made the old Ji-hoon close his eyes and go somewhere else entirely. The old Ji-hoon hadn't existed for 4 months. He lifted the spoon, brought it to his lips with the practiced patience of a man who had reviewed over 300 restaurants in 11 countries. His jaw moved, his tongue assessed the way it always had, searching for layers, for contrast, for the moment when a dish revealed its intention. There was nothing. Or rather, there was something. Temperature, texture, the mechanical fact of chewing. But no flavor, no narrative, no feeling. He set the spoon down. He'd seen 3 doctors, 2 specialists, one who suggested it might be psychological, which Ji-hoon had received the way you receive bad news from someone you don't respect, with cold stillness and no follow-up appointment. He'd done the salt test, the bitter test, the sweet test. He could detect presence, the ghost of flavor, but nothing landed, nothing stuck. It was like watching a film with the sound turned off and being told the music was the whole point. Ji-hoon was 34 years old and the most feared critic in South Korean food media. His column in Gourmet Seoul could close a restaurant in a week. His recommendation could produce a 6-month waitlist overnight. He had built his reputation on a palate that his editor once described in print as surgical. He was now a surgeon with no hands. He opened his laptop, pulled up the draft of his latest review, read the first sentence, deleted it, stared at the blank document until the screensaver came on. His phone rang. His editor, Beyonce. He let it ring. Outside, Seoul glittered and hummed and carried on without him, and Ji-hoon sat in the expensive dark, afraid for the first time in longer than he could remember. The Culinary Institute occupied a glass and concrete building near Hongdae, and its advanced fusion cuisine module was taught by Professor Park Ji-hoon twice a week, Tuesday mornings, 9 a.m. sharp. He arrived at 8:58 with a thermos of black coffee he couldn't taste and a graded stack of practical assessments from the previous week. His expression was the expression of a man who had decided that if he couldn't feel anything, he would at minimum appear to feel nothing, which he'd somehow convinced himself was different. He moved through the rows of stations with the unhurried precision of a man surveying a battlefield he'd already won. The students straightened when he passed. Some of them barely breathed. He stopped at Station 7. The girl at Station 7, Adeyemi Zuri, international student, scholarship candidate, perpetual thorn, was the only student in the room who didn't react to his presence. Not out of confidence, not out of defiance. She simply didn't notice him yet, because she was doing something to a piece of mackerel he couldn't categorize from where he stood. She was scoring it in a pattern he didn't recognize, rubbing something into the cuts with her fingers, spice by the smell of it, though from this distance he couldn't name it. "Miss Adeyemi?" She looked up. Her eyes were very steady, dark and unhurried, like the rest of her. "Professor Park? What are you doing to that fish?" She looked down at it, then back at him. "Marinating it." "In what?" "A beet. Suya spice blend. Modified." He waited for her to apologize. She didn't. That was the problem with her, had been since week 1. She didn't apologize for the things she made. She presented them the way a lawyer presents evidence. "Here, evaluate it fairly." He found it irritating in a way he hadn't fully examined. The assignment was sole meunière with a Korean ingredient substitution. This is not sole. This is mackerel. Sole is too mild for what I'm trying to do with the flavor profile. The fat in mackerel holds the spice better. The Korean substitution is the perilla oil in the finishing sauce. I set the parameters for a reason. The parameters don't allow for the dish I wanted to make. Someone behind her suppressed a sound that might have been a laugh or a gasp. Ji-hoon looked at the mackerel, looked at her, set her practical assessment, marked 61, barely passing, on her station, and moved on. He didn't taste her dish that day. He didn't taste anyone's dish. He hadn't told anyone that. At 11:52 p.m. that same Tuesday, Ji-hoon was on his 3rd attempt to eat dinner when his phone buzzed with a message from a colleague, a food photographer named Kwon Min-jae, who had the taste of someone who'd eaten well in every country and the ethics of someone who'd never had to work very hard for anything. Found something. Can't tell you what it is, just try it. Sending you the contact. Ji-hoon almost didn't follow up. He'd stopped following up with recommendations because they all led to the same dead end, his own broken mouth producing nothing. But it was midnight, and he was lonely in a way that food used to fix, and the DM link Min-jae forwarded him led to a private Instagram with no posts and a bio that said only, "Wednesdays and Saturdays, DM to order, delivery only." He scrolled the story archive. a short video of hands plating something, black-gloved, quick, precise, over a counter he couldn't locate, a photo of a matte black container with a gold flame sticker, a close-up of steam rising from something orange-red and complex and unnamed. He sent a DM. 20 minutes later, he had a confirmation and a delivery window. He didn't know why he was nervous. He was Park Ji-hun. He didn't get nervous about food. The container arrived at 12:41 a.m. He opened it at the kitchen island, under the cold white light of his overhead lamp. Inside, 3 portions. The first, a small cup of something dark and viscous that smelled like it had been reduced for hours. The second, rice, but formed somehow, pressed, with something charred and crisp underneath. The third, a main portion, some kind of braised short rib, except the smell coming off it was nothing he'd ever associated with braised short rib. Deep and smoky and layered with something that pushed against the back of his sinuses with the insistent intimacy of a memory he hadn't summoned. He picked up the chopsticks, lifted a piece of the rib, put it in his mouth. And then something happened that hadn't happened in 4 months. The world had sound again. It wasn't just flavor, it was sequence, like a sentence that made grammatical sense. The fat first, rendering against his tongue, rich without being heavy. Then the smoke, proper smoke, not liquid, not artificial. Then something he couldn't name, a spice that had no Korean referent in his entire vocabulary that moved through the warmth like a countermelody. And underneath everything, deep and mineral and almost ancestral, something fermented, something that had been waiting a long time to be tasted. Ji-han set the chopsticks down. He pressed both hands flat on the countertop. His eyes were open, but he wasn't looking at anything. He picked the chopsticks back up and ate everything in the container with the focused, speechless urgency of someone who'd been lost for a very long time and had just found the road. He ordered again on Saturday, then again the following Wednesday. By the 3rd week, he was ordering every available slot, the maximum the service allowed. And the 4th week, he sent a DM asking if there was any way to arrange something more regular. Z responded in 11 minutes. Menu changes every week, same slots, first come, first served. He stared at that response. He was Park Ji-hun. He did not wait in slots. He ordered within 90 seconds of the Wednesday story going up, setting an alarm the night before like a university student waiting for concert tickets, which was a fact he would have rather died than admit to anyone. He began writing about the food in private, not reviews. He couldn't publish because he couldn't source. He wrote the way he'd written as a young critic before he'd learned to perform authority, honestly, greedily, in run-on sentences that circled a feeling without catching it. The sauce from last Wednesday, I've been thinking about it for 5 days. It tasted like grief and arrival at the same time. I don't know how that's possible. I don't know how someone cooks a contradiction. He started trying to reverse engineer the flavor profiles. He bought ingredients he'd never bought. He called contacts in West African food communities in Seoul and asked questions he framed as research, in a tone that didn't invite follow-up. He got close a few times, close enough to feel the shape of the thing, but never close enough to feel it. Only Z's food made him feel it. He needed to know who Z was. It wasn't difficult to find in the end. The worst discoveries never are. He'd started paying attention to the delivery timing, how quickly the food arrived, how fresh the heat still was when it got to him. He'd estimated, based on 2 months of orders, that Z was cooking within a 5-kilometer radius. He'd noted the container design, the handmade sticker, the specific grade of matte black packaging that was available from exactly 3 wholesale suppliers in the city. He'd asked his photographer friend, Min-jae, casually how he'd found the service. Min-jae had said, "Oh, one of the kids from Hongdae Institute mentioned it. International crowd. You know how they share everything." Ji-hoon had gone very still. He'd thought about Adeyemi and her mackerel, about suya spice modified, about perilla oil in the finishing sauce, about the specific, unhesitating way she'd explained herself, not as justification, but as fact. He'd thought about the first container, the spice that had no Korean referent in his vocabulary, the fermented depth that had taken him 4 months to encounter anywhere. His chest had done something uncomfortable. He'd pulled up the student's records on the faculty portal and searched her name and found her address, Mapogu 4th floor, and looked at it for a long time without moving. He waited until Thursday, his class. He stood at the front of the room and watched her set up her station the way she always did, organized but not rigid, like someone who'd been taught to respect the process but had since formed their own opinion about it. She moved economically. She didn't waste motion. He watched her hands. He thought about the gloved hands in the Instagram story, the plating video, the speed, the precision that looked casual until you timed it. He called her dish to the front for group critique that day, something he didn't often do with students who were borderline failing. Her dish was a Korean-style tteok with a filling she'd created from ground melon seed paste and a tamarind glaze that behaved on the palate like nothing he'd tasted in a culinary school setting. He could taste it. He stood in front of 23 students and tasted her cooking and understood with a cold, clarifying certainty that he'd been eating her cooking for 2 months without knowing her face. He gave her a 74. He said, technically competent, conceptually unfocused. He said it evenly, the way he said everything. His hands were clasped behind his back, and he was aware of them there, held tight, because if he let them go, he wasn't sure what they'd do. Zuri received the grade the way she received everything, with stillness that wasn't the same as acceptance. She wrote something in her notebook. He didn't see what. After class, she didn't leave immediately. She cleaned her station with deliberate care, wiping the counter in long, even strokes, and he stood at the front pretending to review papers until the room was almost empty. Miss Adeyemi? She looked up. Your technique is improving. A pause. That's not what you said in front of everyone. He said nothing to that. Professor Park, is there something else you wanted to say? He looked at her. She looked back. The afternoon light came through the tall windows at a low angle, golden and slightly merciless, and it lit the side of her face in a way that made the whole scene feel like the last frame before a cut. He said, "No, that's all." She left. He stood in the empty kitchen and smelled the ghost of tamarind and melon seed in the air, and felt for the second time since this started, genuinely afraid. The message came the following Saturday, 20 minutes before Z's weekly story was due to go up. Ji-hoon sent it from his personal account, not the fake one he'd created to order anonymously, and he wrote it 3 times before sending the version that said only, "I know who you are. We need to talk. Not as student and professor. Please."
3 minutes passed. 5. 11. Then, where? They met at a cafe in Yeonam-dong that was quiet enough to have a real conversation and public enough that neither of them could fully fall apart. Ji-hoon arrived first. He was already seated when Zuri pushed through the door, and something about seeing her outside the institute in civilian clothes, a yellow, oversized jacket and high-waisted jeans, her braids loose around her shoulders, made the situation feel suddenly, enormously real. She sat across from him. She didn't take off her jacket. Her hands stayed on the table, open, which he understood was either confidence or a decision to appear confident, and he wasn't sure he could tell the difference. "How long have you known?" she asked. No preamble. No small talk. "A week." "How?" He told her. All of it. The delivery radius, the packaging, Minji's offhand comment, the suya spice. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "And the grades." Her voice was very careful. Were the grades because of this?" "No." He said it quickly, which surprised him. "The grades were the grades. I graded your work before I knew. But you suspected." He stopped. "By the Thursday class, yes. I suspected by then." She looked at him steadily. "You tasted my tteok and gave me a 74. He didn't answer that. "You've been eating my food for 2 months, she said, and you've been failing me. You've been running an unauthorized food business from student housing using institute kitchens during off hours, Miss Adeyemi, which is a violation of at least 4 clauses in your enrollment agreement and potentially your scholarship terms." She went very still. He hadn't meant it to come out like that. It came out like that. So that's how this works, she said slowly. You find out I'm the one feeding you, and your first move is a threat. I wasn't. What were you then? The cafe hummed around them. Someone at the next table laughed at something on their phone. Ji-hoon looked at his coffee. He hadn't ordered it. It had just appeared, and he could smell it, which meant nothing useful because smell had never left him. I lost my sense of taste, he said. 4 months ago. I haven't been able to taste anything. The shift in her face was subtle. Not sympathy, more like recalculation. Like someone who'd been holding a shape in their mind and just received a piece that changed the whole geometry. Nothing, she said. Temperature. Texture. Presence. No flavor. And mine. Yours I can taste. He said it flatly, which was the only way he knew how to say things that frightened him. Everything you make. Completely. I don't know why. She sat back. Her hands came off the table and folded in her lap, out of sight. I don't know what to do with that, she said. Neither do I. A long beat. Outside, the wind pushed a plastic bag down the street and a delivery motorbike blurred past, and the streetlights were just beginning to consider coming on, the sky making up its mind between blue and gray. If you report me, Zuri said, I lose the scholarship. I go home. She said it without drama, which made it worse. Just facts, presented by someone who'd learned to present things without decoration. I've been here 2 years. I have 1 left. This food, this thing I've been building, it was never supposed to be a problem. It was just supposed to pay for groceries. I know. Do you? He didn't answer. You're going to report me, she said. Not a question. I haven't decided. Then why did you want to meet? He looked at her across the small table, at the steadiness of her, the controlled surface over something much less controlled, the particular quality of someone who'd been underestimated so many times they'd developed a posture around it. Because I needed to see your face, he said. When I told you I knew. She frowned. What did you see? Someone who was going to handle it either way. A pause. I found that, he stopped. I found that difficult to ignore. The cafe settled around them. Neither of them moved. The moment held the particular tension of a decision that hasn't been made yet, but is already leaning. Ji-hoon didn't report her that week. Or the next. What he did instead was worse. In a different way, he kept grading her work with the same standards as before, which meant she kept hovering between passing and failing, which meant anyone paying attention could see that the professor was going out of his way to neither protect nor destroy the student he'd confronted privately, which meant people started paying attention. The rumor that reached the institute's administration did not come from Ji-hoon. It came from another student, a classmate of Zuri's who'd ordered from Z twice and recognized the container design in the background of a video Zuri had accidentally posted to her personal story and then deleted in 40 seconds. But 40 seconds was long enough. The investigation opened on a Wednesday. By Thursday, the story had been shared in a food industry group chat with 412 members, including 2 journalists. By Friday, Gourmet Seoul had called Ji-hoon's editor, and his editor had called him. And the conversation had lasted 22 minutes and left Ji-hoon standing at his window, looking at the city below, with the specific stillness of someone watching something he built begin to come apart. The headline that ran Saturday morning was not kind to either of them. It was the kind of headline that asked questions it already knew the answers to. Was Seoul's most feared critic compromised by a student's underground kitchen? And answered them in the subtext, in the careful neutrality of quotation marks around the word mentor. Zuri's phone, Ji-hoon imagined, didn't stop ringing Saturday. His didn't stop either. He called her once. She didn't answer. He didn't call again. The Institute's review board convened on a Monday that felt like February even though it was April. Ji-hoon sat on one side of a long table. Zuri sat on the other side with the Institute's international student liaison beside her, a woman who looked like she genuinely wanted to help and was genuinely unprepared for the room she was in.
The board asked Zuri about the food service. She answered everything, directly, without deflection or performance. Yes, she had used the apartment kitchen. No, she had not used the Institute's facilities. Yes, she had charged money. Yes, she understood the terms of her scholarship. Then someone on the board said, "We've also received a report suggesting that Professor Park may have been a customer of this service and that this relationship may have affected student evaluations." The room changed temperature. Ji-hoon said, "I was a customer. I didn't know who I was ordering from for the majority of that period. My evaluations of Ms. Adeyemi's work are documented and defensible." And when you discovered her identity, a pause that lasted exactly as long as honesty requires. "I chose not to report the violation immediately." Why? He looked at Zuri across the table. She was looking at the board, not at him. Her jaw was set and her hands were flat on the table, and she was doing the thing she always did, holding the surface still over whatever was moving underneath. "Because I was trying to determine the right thing to do," he said, "and I took too long." The board member leaned forward. "Professor Park, are you telling this board that a student's cooking affected your professional judgment?" Ji-hoon thought about the first container, the short rib, the 4 months of silence that had ended in a single bite, the private notebook full of run-on sentences about grief and arrival. "Yes," he said, "that's what I'm telling you." Zuri finally looked at him. Her expression was unreadable in the way that very readable things sometimes are, too much happening too close together to separate. The board's findings took 11 days to arrive. Zuri received a formal reprimand and a 2-week suspension of her scholarship stipend. She was not expelled. The liaison had fought for her, apparently, with a tenacity that surprised everyone, including the liaison. Her grades, all of them, all semester, were reviewed by an independent panel who found them, across the board, consistent with her demonstrated skill level and harsh by exactly the degree that Ji-hoon was harsh with everyone, which meant the 74 stood, which meant, she told him later, she'd actually earned a higher mark than he gave her, and she'd known it at the time, and she'd said nothing because she'd learned not to argue with the grade until she could argue with the work itself. Ji-hoon received a formal censure for the delay in reporting. He was asked to recuse himself from evaluating her work for the remainder of the semester, which he agreed to without argument. The Gourmet Seoul piece never ran. His editor, to his credit, had sat on it, held the decision for the full 11 days of the investigation, and then, when the findings were less explosive than the original rumor had promised, quietly let it go. Ji-hoon called him to say thank you. His editor said, "Don't make it interesting again." Ji-hoon said he'd try. The first time they were in the kitchen voluntarily, not as professor and student, not in a review room, not across a hostile table, was a Saturday 3 weeks after the investigation closed. Zuri had texted him. One sentence. "If you want to understand why you can taste my food, you should watch me cook." He arrived at 8 p.m. The broken elevator was still broken. By the 4th floor, his tie was loosened, which was as close to casual as he got in those days. The apartment was small in the way that places are small when they're organized by someone who knows how to use space. She'd set a stool at the end of the counter island, one stool, deliberate placement, and there was already something on the stove making the particular sound of something that had been started hours ago and was nearly ready. "Sit," she said, not looking up. He sat. He watched her cook for 20 minutes without speaking. He moved through the kitchen the way she moved through everything, in her own rhythm, which was unhurried but not slow, which was intuitive but not careless. She tasted constantly, small tastes, checking in with what the pot was saying and responding in kind. Her face changed when she tasted, not dramatically, small adjustments, a slight tension releasing, a brief look of consideration, occasionally something that was almost private in its satisfaction. Ji-hoon watched her the way he used to watch great chefs, not looking for technique, looking for relationship, the thing between a cook and their food that tells you whether they're performing or conversing. She was conversing. "You cook like you're listening to it," he said. "I am. Isn't that what you're supposed to do?" Most people don't. Most people are afraid their food won't say anything good. He considered that. "Are you afraid of that?" "I used to be." she added, something to the pot. The perilla, torn by hand, same as always. In the first year here, everything I made felt wrong, like I was apologizing for it before anyone could reject it. And the food, she shook her head, you can taste an apology. It makes everything flat. Something in his chest moved. He didn't address it directly. When did it change? She finally looked at him. When I stopped trying to make food that would pass and started making food that was through. The stove clicked softly. Steam rose. The smell in the apartment was the smell of his first container, deep and layered and pushing against something at the back of his memory. And Ji-hoon understood suddenly, sitting on that stool in that small fourth-floor kitchen, that the reason he could taste her food and nothing else wasn't medical, or rather, it wasn't only medical. He'd spent 4 months eating food that was being made for approval, for performance, for the version of excellence that knows someone important is watching. And his broken palate, whatever its clinical cause, had stopped being able to register that frequency. Zuri's food was made for something else. It was made the way she'd described, from truth. From the specific, irreducible fact of who she was, Nigerian and in Seoul and 23 and trained and untrained and homesick and hungry in ways that went past food, and carrying her mother's prayers in a stock pot like they were an actual ingredient. You couldn't fake that. You couldn't perform that. And apparently, at least for him, you couldn't miss it. She set the bowl in front of him. Egusi, but not the egusi of his research, not the egusi he'd tried to reconstruct in his own kitchen with ordered ingredients and careful notes. This was hers. It was finished with something she didn't name and didn't explain, and it sat in front of him in the low, warm light of her kitchen lamp like it had always been there. He picked up the spoon. "You're going to give me a grade, aren't you?" she said dryly. She was leaning against the opposite counter with her arms crossed, and the small, controlled smile she used when something was almost funny, but she wasn't ready to fully commit. "I don't grade you anymore, formally. But, he looked at the bowl. 100. She looked at him, a real look, unguarded for a second, something passing across her face that she didn't hide in time. "You failed me for 2 months. Yes. And now? You were always 100. I was always broken. Those are different problems." The kitchen was quiet. The stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, Seoul did what it always did, carried on, oblivious, the lights of a million lives stacked against the dark. Zuri unfolded her arms. She pulled a second stool from beside the refrigerator and set it next to his at the counter. She sat down. And they ate together in the small, warm space she'd built from nothing, in a city that hadn't asked for either of them, in a kitchen that smelled like 2 worlds, finally agreeing on something. Months later, when a journalist asked Ji-hoon what had changed in his writing, because something clearly had, the whole city could feel it, the way you feel a window open in a room that's been closed too long, he thought about that night, about the stool, about the bowl, about the specific quality of food made without apology. He said, "I learned to taste something true." The journalist assumed he meant a dish. He let them assume.